Wilhelm Johann Gustav Keitel, 1882–1946, was one of the most controversial and, at the same time, iconic figures in the leadership of the Third Reich. A field marshal and head of the Wehrmacht High Command, OKW, he was Germany's highest-ranking military officer for most of World War II. However, he went down in history not as an outstanding strategist, but with the derogatory nickname Hitler's lackey, which became a symbol of unconditional obedience and blind execution of criminal orders. His path is a story of how a career officer of the old Prussian school became one of the main accomplices of the Nazi regime, whose signature was on the most monstrous directives. Keitel's military career began long before the Nazis came to power, back in Kaiser's Germany. He was born into a land-owning family in Braunschweig and, following tradition, chose a military career, joining an artillery regiment in 1901. Keitel fought in World War I, where he was seriously wounded, and then continued his service in the Reichswehr, the army of the Weimar Republic. He was a typical representative of the Prussian officers' corps, efficient, disciplined, but lacking in outstanding leadership skills. Other military leaders, such as Günther von Kluge, considered him a complete zero, incapable of making independent decisions. It was precisely these qualities, diligence and lack of personal ambition, that attracted Adolf Hitler's attention. Keitel's rapid rise began in the 1930s. In 1938, after reorganizing the military leadership, Hitler abolished the War Ministry and created the High Command of the Wehrmacht, OKW, placing Keitel at the head of this new body. Thus, a simple officer became the Führer's chief military advisor, the link between him and the army. He remained in this position until the end of the war. In Hitler's office, Keitel was a predictable figure. Leaning over a pile of documents, he signed another order without question, even if it contradicted the laws of war and human morality. It was his signature that appeared on the Order on Commissars, which ordered the shooting of captured political officers, and on the Darkness and Fog Directive, which doomed thousands of people in the occupied territories to disappear in concentration camps. Although it is known that Keitel initially objected to the attacks on France and the USSR, resigning both times, Hitler did not accept his resignation. Over time, his objections subsided, and he became an obedient tool in the hands of the dictator. He defined his role simply, which was reflected in his defense at the Nuremberg trials, where he tried to justify his actions. "I am not the president or the chancellor. I am just a soldier following orders." However, this argument did not hold water with the tribunal. His boundless loyalty and willingness to carry out any orders, even the most criminal ones, from the Führer, made him an accomplice to horrific atrocities. He was found guilty of crimes against peace, humanity, and war crimes, and sentenced to death. Keitel's role as Chief of the High Command of the Wehrmacht. With his appointment as Chief of the High Command of the Wehrmacht, OKW, on February 4, 1938, Wilhelm Keitel formally assumed the highest military position in Nazi Germany. The OKW was created by Hitler to replace the abolished War Ministry and was intended to be the central command for all armed forces, the Army, Navy, and Air Force. The plan was for Keitel to become the Führer's chief military advisor and a link between him and the generals. However, in practice, his powers were severely limited, and the OKW itself became more of Hitler's personal military office than a full-fledged strategic headquarters. Keitel's duties were mainly administrative. He was responsible for communicating the Führer's orders to front commanders and the various branches of the armed forces, coordinating the actions of various departments, and preparing documents for Hitler. He was the typewriter for directives, many of which were openly criminal in nature. It was his signature that sealed such infamous orders as On Commissars of June 6, 1941, which prescribed the immediate execution of captured Red Army political officers, and the Darkness and Fog Directive of December 7, 1941, which authorized the secret abduction and destruction of resistance activists in the occupied territories. Keitel's influence on military policy was minimal.
Hitler quickly concentrated all operational control in his own hands, leaving Keitel with the role of executor. Strategic planning, especially on the Eastern Front, was the responsibility of the Army High Command, OKH, while OKW dealt with secondary theaters of war. Despite his reputation as an unquestioning subordinate, there is evidence that Keitel occasionally expressed timid doubts about the Führer's decisions. It is known that he objected to the plans to attack France and later the Soviet Union, even submitting a request for resignation on both occasions, but Hitler did not accept it. In 1942, he dared to openly oppose the dictator for the last time, standing up for the dismissed Field Marshal von List. However, these rare displays of dissent were quickly suppressed by Hitler's iron will, and Keitel returned to his usual role. Upon receiving another directive from the Führer, he stamped it without further ado, demonstrating absolute obedience. His position was clearly articulated by himself. "I signed what the Führer orders, for there is no other way." This phrase became the quintessential of his service as head of the OKW, a service in which loyalty to one man proved to be higher than duty, honor, and the laws of war.
The order on commissars is evidence of unquestioning obedience. One of the darkest symbols of Wilhelm Keitel's role in the Nazi war machine was the Kommissar Order. One of the darkest symbols of Wilhelm Keitel's role in the Nazi war machine was the Kommissar Order, Kommissarbefehl. This document, officially titled Directives for the Treatment of Political Commissars, was issued by the High Command of the Wehrmacht on June 6, 1941, just 2 weeks before the invasion of the Soviet Union. It stands as irrefutable proof of the extent of Keitel's subservience to Hitler, transforming Germany's highest military authority into an instrument for committing mass murder. The order directly violated all existing norms of international law and the laws of war. Its essence was simple and monstrous. All captured political commissars of the Red Army were not to be considered prisoners of war. Instead, they were to be immediately separated from other prisoners and shot on the spot. The text of the order described political officers as bearers of resistance and ideological enemies, in the fight against whom one cannot count on the enemy adhering to the principles of humanity or international law. In the dark room where the fates of millions were decided, Keitel's signature on this document became a fatal seal, legitimizing war crimes. Many criminal orders passed down from Hitler acquired the status of mandatory directives for all Wehrmacht units precisely because of Keitel's endorsement. Thus, he acted not merely as a passive executor, but as a key accomplice who gave the force of military law to inhumane directives. His signature transformed the Führer's ideological hatred into a systematic practice of mass executions at the front. This act demonstrates Keitel's complete moral capitulation. He not only failed to oppose an order that contradicted the very essence of military honor, but he also ensured its implementation. Although some German generals claimed after the war that they had sabotaged this order, in reality, it led to brutal repressions and the deaths of thousands. The essence of his position is captured in a phrase that characterizes his service. The order was signed without objection, loyalty above all. For Keitel, loyalty to Hitler proved more important than the laws of war, humanity, and his own conscience, which ultimately sealed his fate at the Nuremberg trials. Other controversial orders and Keitel's role in war crimes. The Kommissar Order was just one of many criminal documents bearing Wilhelm Keitel's signature. His role as chief of the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, was to give legal force to Hitler's most radical and inhumane initiatives, turning them into binding directives. It was his signature that legitimized terror in the occupied territories, effectively erasing the line between military action and genocide. One such document was the Directive of May 13, 1941, on military jurisdiction in the Barbarossa area and on special powers of the troops. This order effectively exempted German soldiers from military court for crimes committed against the civilian population in Soviet territory. It gave officers the right to execute anyone without trial or investigation on the mere suspicion of hostile actions. Furthermore, Keitel authorized the transfer of all judicial and administrative power in the occupied territories to Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, which paved the way for the activities of the Einsatzgruppen and the systematic extermination of Jews, communists, and other undesirable elements. Further evidence of his complicity is the Order of September 16, 1941, which established a policy of collective punishment. For the death of one German soldier, 50 to 100 communists were to be executed. This directive led to mass shootings of hostages throughout occupied Europe. And on December 7, 1941, Keitel signed the Night and Fog Decree, Nacht und Nebel, according to which members of the resistance in Western Europe were to be secretly abducted and sent to concentration camps in Germany, where they would disappear without a trace. The goal, as stated in Keitel's accompanying letter, was effective intimidation, achieved through uncertainty about the fate of the arrested. These and many other orders became the legal basis for committing monstrous war crimes, including the Holocaust and the ruthless suppression of any resistance. There are suggestions that Keitel, raised in the traditions of the old Prussian army, may have had deep-seated doubts about the moral rightness of these decisions. However, fear of Hitler and an ingrained habit of obedience forced him to remain silent and act. The orders sealed the death sentences of thousands, while Keitel remained a faceless figure in the shadows, perhaps hiding his internal torments, but consistently performing his function. As historians note, without Keitel, many of these orders would not have had official weight. It was his signature that turned the Führer's will into law for the Wehrmacht.
Keitel's legacy and his role at the Nuremberg trials. The end of World War II brought Wilhelm Keitel to the dock of the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. Here, before a world demanding justice, the tired, elderly man in a general's uniform became a living embodiment of unconditional military obedience devoid of any moral compass. His case became a precedent that answered the question of the responsibility of an executor of criminal orders. At the trial, Keitel was charged on all 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning, initiating, and waging wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. His defense was built on one main argument: the principle of soldierly obedience. Befehl ist Befehl. An order is an order. Keitel did not deny signing the monstrous directives, but insisted that he acted solely as a soldier, loyal to his oath, and obliged to carry out the orders of the Supreme Commander, Adolf Hitler. "I obeyed orders. I do not think I could have done otherwise," became the leitmotif of his testimony. However, the tribunal rejected this line of defense. The prosecution presented irrefutable evidence that Keitel was not just a postman, but an active accomplice. He was present at the planning of aggressive wars, personally made amendments to orders, and legitimized mass murder and terror. His own handwritten notes on the margins of one document, which contested knightly methods of warfare, contained the resolution: "This is about the destruction of an ideology. Therefore, I approve and support these measures." In his memoirs, written in a Nuremberg prison while awaiting his sentence, Keitel tried to somewhat soften his role, presenting himself as almost the last barrier against Hitler's most insane decisions. He claimed that his objections to the attacks on France and the USSR were dictated by concern for the Wehrmacht. But these belated attempts at self-justification could not hide the main point. By the verdict of the tribunal, Wilhelm Keitel was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by hanging. His fate became a grim warning and a historical lesson. Keitel's legacy is a symbol of how a military leader, loyal to soldierly discipline, can become a lackey of a dictatorship, completely losing his humanity and moral responsibility under the pressure of a totalitarian regime. He became the personification of the destructive force that lies in blind obedience, unrestricted by conscience.